Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout 3, where today we're going to be taking a look at all the swords in Fallout 3, of which we have 5. There is quite a few variants of the swords, so we're going to be taking a look at the Chinese sword and its unique variants, the samurai sword, and the shish kebab. So first up we have the Chinese officer sword. And this is a sword that you can find throughout the Wasteland. It's actually not too uncommon to find. A lot of the Chinese ghoul soldiers that were left over from the war still have their swords, so you can take them off of them. They also tend to have the Chinese pistol, Chinese assault rifle, and other Chinese gear. So the Chinese sword, for the stats, does 10 damage per hit, which is actually pretty decent. That's pretty good for a melee weapon. This one does 23 DPS, also nice. Has a 2x crit modifier, so it is very likely to hit crits. This has 15 crit damage, so it actually does more than its regular damage, which is good. This one costs 28 action points, which isn't too high. It's about what we've seen with a lot of other melee weapons. This one weighs 3, and this one has 1,000 hits in it before it breaks. It is actually quite durable. The Chinese officer sword is really good for being a pretty strong early to mid-game weapon that you can just keep using without having to worry about it breaking. For the general pros of the Chinese sword and kind of all these weapons, they do have pretty good damage and pretty good damage per second, and the Chinese sword specifically has really good item health. 1,000 hits in it is a lot. You're definitely going to be able to find more swords to fix up yours with before that really becomes an issue. The major con, at least to the Chinese sword, is that it does kind of fall off later. The unique variants, not so much, and the other swords that we're going to be talking about, not really. But the Chinese sword isn't the strongest melee weapon in the game. It does start out pretty good. It starts out fairly solid, but it does kind of fall off a little bit later. There is some perks that we should talk about with this. Ninja is a really good one since it will just get you more crit hit chance and you get more sneak damage, so that one's fantastic on any sort of melee or unarmed build. And Pyromaniac specifically for the shish kebab. This isn't going to help with any of the other weapons, but that one does count as a fire weapon, and that is probably the strongest weapon and the major reason why you're going with Pyromaniac, unless you want to be using the heavy incinerator, in which case I understand that too. For an overall rating for the Chinese officer sword, I would probably put this on the very high end of C tier or maybe into the low end of B tier. It's honestly a pretty solid weapon. It rivals a lot of the early game melee weapons that you can get. It's just that I don't find these super early on. I tend to end up going with like the baseball bat or the lead pipe early on if I'm going to go with a melee build. And then usually I'm running somewhere. If I run to a DLC, I probably have some better melee weapon from that one. If I go to the pit, I got the auto axe. If I go to Anchorage, I have the next sword, or one of the next swords that's coming up. Let's move on to the unique version of the Chinese sword that's in the base game. This is called the Vampire's Edge. And the Vampire's Edge is kind of Vance's sword, sort of, because he also has a shish kebab. So he'll use the shish kebab, but you can get the Vampire's Edge in the area where the vampires are, the cannibals. And this one is just stronger than a regular Chinese officer sword. So this one does 15 damage per hit, which is pretty nice, 35 damage per second, has a 3x crit modifier, which is really good. That's one of the highest for melee weapons. This one does 20 crit damage. It stays with the theme of doing more crit damage than it does do regular damage. This one costs 28 action points. This one only weighs 1 weight. It's very lightweight, and this still has 1,000 item health to it. This one is just a straight upgrade to the Chinese sword, and I think that this one is definitely worth going out of your way to get if you're going to go for a melee build. This one is quite strong, and even if you don't really intend on using it that much, 1 weight doesn't really matter. You can just toss it onto any loadout, and then, you know, if your other weapons are getting broken, you can just pull this thing out, and it's probably not going to break for a while. I would put this one higher up than the Chinese officer sword just for the utility of it. I'd put it up into A tier. I think it's actually a really solid weapon for Fallout 3. Then we have one more Chinese officer sword, which is the unique variant that you get at the end of Operation Anchorage. You get this one once you've opened up the vault. This is Jigwee's shock sword. I don't know if I'm saying that word right either. Not sure if it is actually Jigwe or maybe it's Jigwe. Either way, you get his shock sword, which this one is really strong. This one does 35 damage per hit, and it does an additional 2 damage for 5 seconds because of that electricity. So you're doing damage over time. And that is a lot of damage for melee weapons in this game. This also has 83 damage per second, which is one of the highest. This one has a 2x crit modifier, although this one only has 25 crit damage, so it is less than its regular damage, but still more than the other officer swords. This one also costs 28 action points, also weighs 3. This one does have substantially less health, though, at only 486 hits before it breaks. So you get a less durable weapon that does much higher damage. That is a good trade-off, and if you want to rush Operation Anchorage right away, which is probably the easiest DLC to rush right away, and it gives you the biggest advantage at the start, This weapon is really, really good for a melee build. For a rating for Jigwee's Shock Sword, I'm probably going to put this one up into S tier. It's really good early on. It's pretty good later on. The item health is kind of less than it, so it's a little bit not as useful then. But it's still a very solid melee weapon for melee builds, so it's going to go up there. All right, let's move on from the Chinese officer swords to the samurai sword. This is the sword that you can get inside Mothership Zeta. You can actually get this in the cargo hold or in the trash chute, it's one of the two, and then you can give it back to the samurai if you would like. If not, you can keep it and use it as a regular weapon. So the katana does 24 damage per hit, which is quite high. This does 55 damage per second, which is also really good. Has a 2x crit modifier, also very nice. Does 40 crit damage, a lot more crit damage than it has regular damage. Only costs 19 action points. This is one of the lowest costing action point melee weapons, which is really, really good. This weighs 3 weight and has 833 damage per second. This is really good. This is actually really nice, especially if you want to rush Mothership Zeta. It is arguably one of the strongest melee weapons. It's pretty much on par with Jigwee's Shock Sword in a lot of ways, where it's better for a VATS build, it has better HP, less damage per second, but if you're building for a crit build, you'll probably be able to match the Shock Sword. So this one I'm also going to put up into S tier. Then the last weapon we got to talk about is the Shish Kebab. This weapon you do have to make, although there is at least Vance that carries a Shish Kebab around, so if you kill him, then you can take his Shish Kebab. So the Shish Kebab is a flaming sword that you have to make at workbenches. In order to do this, you're going to need to have a schematic, and you're going to need to have the parts. The 3 schematics that you can get from this, one of them you do get from Vance himself. If you do his quest and you complete Blood Ties, then he will give you this, which is pretty awesome. You can buy one from a trader called Lucky Harith, who is a traveling merchant. You can just buy from them and you'll get this one. And the other one that you can get is from an unmarked Brotherhood Outcast shack that's near a antenna array towards the north of the map. You can get it in there. So actually getting that one is pretty easy. If you know where it is, you can just rush right to it. Then you don't need to buy it or do a quest for it. And you can make these right away. If you want to be making shish kebabs, this will require 1 motorcycle gas tank, 1 motorcycle handbrake, 1 lawnmower blade, and 1 pilot light. This isn't super difficult to find items, so you can actually make a shish kebab really early on. And for stats, the shish kebab is quite good. This one does 35 damage per hit, as well as it deals an additional 2 damage for 5 seconds because of the fire on it. This one has 81 damage per second, one of the highest out of any of the melee weapons. I think it actually is the highest, at least if you have Pyromaniac, because this one does get stronger than something like Jigwee's Shock Sword. This one has a 2x crit modifier, so it's more likely to hit crits. Only does 24 crit damage, though. It actually does less crit damage than kind of what I would expect. This one costs 28 action points to be using in VATS, same as a lot of the other swords, weighs 3 weight, and this one has 429 hits in it before it breaks. So quite a bit less than some of our other melee weapons, although you can make multiple shish kebabs, so you can always be fixing these up. The shish kebab is probably the strongest melee weapon in Fallout 3, with a few exceptions. There are some other ones that can kind of compete with it. Some of the other ones that we talked about here, like the Samurai Sword and Jigwee's Shock Sword, can be pretty strong too. So I'd put this one high up into S tier. I think it is the best of these swords that we've got. So that'll do it for the swords in Fallout 3. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Tell me what you thought about each of the Samurai Swords, Chinese Swords, and the Shish Kebab. I'd love to hear that. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.